Long before the world learned to measure time in centuries and empires, there was a coastline where the Mediterranean Sea breathed gently against pale sand. The waves did not crash here. They whispered. They moved with patience as if they understood that something important was waiting to be born upon this shore. If you were to stand there in the early hours of dawn, around the year 331 BCE, you would see a quiet place. Fishermen pulling in their nets, birds gliding low over the water. The air carrying the scent of salt and warm stone. Nothing yet suggested that this place would become one of the most ambitious human experiments ever attempted. This was Egypt, ancient, enduring, already old when many civilizations were still learning how to shape clay into bricks. But this particular stretch of coast was still untouched by greatness. Not for long, because a young king had arrived. His name was Alexander, later called the Great. He was not yet 30 years old, but he carried the weight of conquest like a second shadow. He had crossed deserts and rivers, broken armies, and redrawn maps. Yet here, on this quiet shoreline, he was not thinking about war. He was thinking about memory. According to ancient historians, Alexander stood by the sea and imagined a city unlike any that had come before, a city that would not merely rule land, but gather the thoughts of the world. A city where Greek philosophy would meet Egyptian wisdom, where geometry could sit beside poetry, where the known world could be collected, ordered, and preserved. He traced the outline of this dream city directly onto the sand, and so Alexandria was born first as an idea. A city between worlds, Alexandria was carefully placed. To the north, the Mediterranean opened toward Greece, Rome, and the wider European world. To the south and east, Egypt stretched inward, carrying millennia of religious tradition, astronomy, and sacred texts. To the east beyond Egypt lay Persia, India, and lands still half imagined by Greek scholars. This city would sit between worlds, a crossroads not only of trade but of thought. Alexander did not live to see his dream fulfilled. He would die only a few years later, far from this shore. But his idea survived him, passed like a torch to those who believed that knowledge itself could be a form of power. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured. Egypt came under the rule of one of his generals, Ptolemy Isoter. Ptolemy was a soldier, but he was also a student of philosophy. He had studied under Aristotle, the great teacher who once taught Alexander himself. Ptolemy understood something rare among rulers, that armies could conquer land, but ideas could conquer time. And so, in Alexandria, he began to build not only palaces and harbors, but something far more ambitious. He began to build a house for all knowledge. The dream of total knowledge, the idea was breathtaking in its simplicity and arrogance. To collect every book ever written, not Egyptian books alone, not Greek texts alone, but all writings from every land, every culture, every language that could be reached by ship or caravan. This place would become known as the Library of Alexandria. But it was more than a library in the modern sense. It was part of a larger institution called the Mauseon, a sanctuary of the muses, the divine patrons of art, science, and memory. Scholars lived there, ate there, walked its shaded corridors, and debated beneath columns while fountains murmured nearby. This was not a silent building. It was alive with voices, voices reading aloud, translating, arguing gently over the meanings of words written centuries before. Voices attempting to understand the stars, the body, the nature of numbers, and the soul of the universe itself. Scrolls arrived by the thousands, Ships entering Alexandria's harbor were reportedly searched. Any books found on board were taken, copied, and studied. Sometimes the originals were kept and copies returned, a quiet, unapologetic declaration that Alexandria valued knowledge above ownership. To some, this was theft. To others, preservation. Scrolls, not books in this ancient world, knowledge was fragile. There were no printed pages, no digital backups, no machines to replicate text endlessly. Everything was handwritten, carefully, slowly, on papyrus made from reeds that grew along the Nile. A single scroll might represent years of work, generations of thought captured in ink. To lose one was to lose a voice forever. The librarians of Alexandria understood this. They cataloged scrolls meticulously. They compared versions of texts, corrected copying errors, and attempted to reconstruct originals that had already begun to decay elsewhere. Some ancient sources claim the library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Others suggest fewer. The truth remains uncertain, but even the lower estimates are staggering. Within its walls were works of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, geography, philosophy, drama, history, religious texts, observations of nature, maps of the known world, and perhaps, just perhaps, ideas we no longer even have names for. A quiet revolution. What made the library truly revolutionary was not just what it stored, but how it thought. Here, scholars began to question myths gently rather than reject them outright. They measured the Earth's circumference with shadows and geometry. They dissected animals and sometimes human bodies to understand anatomy. They charted the stars not as omens, but as patterns governed by rules. This was not rebellion. It was curiosity, the kind that grows slowly, patiently, like firelight flickering against stone walls. Imagine walking through its halls. Sunlight filters in through high openings. Dust floats in the air. The scent of papyrus, oil lamps, and sea breeze mingles softly. A scholar pauses, reading aloud in a low voice while another listens, nodding thoughtfully. Outside, the city hums. Inside, time seems to slow. This was Alexandria at its height, a place where the past and future sat at the same table. The fragility beneath the grandeur, yet even at its peak, the library lived under quiet threat. Papyrus burns easily, political power shifts, religions rise, empires fall. Knowledge depends not only on creation, but on protection, and protection is never permanent. The library was supported by rulers, and rulers change. Each generation inherited the question, is knowledge sacred or useful? When knowledge serves power, it is preserved. When it challenges power, it becomes vulnerable. No one in Alexandria's golden age could fully imagine how fragile their dream truly was. They believed they were building something eternal. History would prove otherwise. A gentle closing, and so, in this first quiet chapter of our journey, the Library of Alexandria stands not yet as a ruin, but as a promise. A city shaped by wind and water. A dream traced in sand and made of stone. A place where humanity dared to believe that all knowledge could live together in harmony. For now, the lamps are lit. The scrolls are safe. The voices continue to speak softly beneath the columns. And so, as the echoes of the ancient world softened into the night, the dream of Alexandria rested gently beside the sea, waiting for time to test its flame. The sun rose gently over Alexandria, not with urgency, but with assurance. Each morning, its light slid across marble steps, along colonnaded walkways and into courtyards where olive trees stood patiently beside shallow pools. The city did not rush to meet the day. It welcomed it. Within the grounds of the Mausian, the heart that nourished the great library, mornings began softly. Lamps were extinguished. Windows were opened to the sea air. Sandaled footsteps echoed faintly on stone floors as scholars emerged from their chambers, carrying tablets, scrolls, and questions they had fallen asleep thinking about. This was not a place of hurried ambition. It was a place of slow devotion. Here lived the keepers of memory, men from many lands, speaking many tongues, bound together by a shared belief that understanding the world was a sacred act. A community of minds unlike other centers of learning in the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria was not simply a destination for study. It was a home. Scholars were invited, sometimes summoned from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Greece, Asia Minor, Persia, Egypt, even distant India. They arrived by ship, their belongings modest, their greatest treasures carried in memory. The Ptolemaic rulers provided them with lodging, meals, stipends, and exemption from taxes. In return, the scholars gave their lives to study, teaching, writing, observing, and preserving. This arrangement created something rare in antiquity, a community where survival did not depend on manual labor or political favor, but on thought itself. The days flowed with a quiet rhythm, morning readings, midday discussions in shaded porticos, afternoons devoted to copying texts, correcting errors, or walking slowly while thinking, a practice many believed essential to clarity. There was no bell to announce time. The movement of light across the floor was enough. The librarians at the center of this world stood the librarians themselves, not silent custodians, but active scholars. The most famous among them was Callimachus of Cyrene, a poet and scholar whose task was almost unimaginable in scale, to organize the entire body of human writing. Callimachus created the Pinaques, a vast catalog that classified works by subject, author, and origin. It was not merely a list, but a map of human thought, an attempt to bring order to centuries of accumulated wisdom. Each scroll bore a tag identifying its contents. Shelves were arranged not randomly, but intentionally. Mathematics did not mingle with drama. Medicine had its own place. So did astronomy, law, rhetoric, and philosophy. This act of classification quietly changed the world. For the first time, knowledge was not just gathered, it was structured. And structure invites progress. The scrolls arrive Alexandria's harbor was always alive. Ships came bearing grain, spices, textiles, and books. According to ancient accounts, every ship that entered the harbor was subject to inspection. Any written work on board was brought to the library where scribes made careful copies. The originals were sometimes kept, labeled as from the ships, while copies were returned to their owners. Whether this practice was universal or occasional is still debated, but its symbolism is unmistakable. Alexandria was hungry not for conquest, but for comprehension. Scrolls arrived in many languages: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian, Aramaic. Translators worked patiently, comparing words, debating meanings, and inventing new terms when old ones proved insufficient. Translation itself became a scholarly art. In Alexandria, ideas learned to travel. The Septuagint and sacred words, one of the most significant translation projects undertaken here was the Septuagint. the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures. According to tradition, 72 scholars worked independently on the translation, and when their results were compared, they matched perfectly. Whether literal truth or symbolic legend, the story reflects Alexandria's reverence for careful transmission. This work mattered deeply. By translating sacred texts into Greek, Alexandria made them accessible to the wider Mediterranean world. Ideas that once belonged to a single people now entered a global conversation. Knowledge here was not meant to remain isolated. It was meant to circulate. Science without fear. What truly distinguished the scholars of Alexandria was not their reverence for the past, but their willingness to examine it gently. They read Homer not only as poetry, but as history. They studied myths not to discard them, but to understand what truths they might contain. They measured, observed, compared. Eratosthenes, one of the library's most remarkable scholars, calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy, using nothing more than shadows, geometry, and patience. At noon on the summer solstice, he observed that in the city of Sin, modern Aswan, the sun cast no shadow in a deep well. At the same moment in Alexandria, a shadow appeared. From this difference, he deduced the Earth's curvature. The world suddenly became measurable. And yet there was no triumph in this realization, only quiet wonder. The Earth was not diminished by measurement. It was made more magnificent. Medicine, maps, and the body Alexandrian scholars also transformed medicine. Here, for the first time in the Western world, systematic anatomical study took place. Physicians like Herophilus and Erasistratus explored the human body with care, seeking to understand nerves, blood flow, and organs. They distinguished between veins and arteries. They identified the brain as the center of intelligence rather than the heart, a radical idea for its time. These discoveries were not rushed. They were recorded carefully, debated respectfully, and preserved for future generations. In geography, scholars attempted to map the known world. They collected travelers' accounts, sailors' logs, and military reports. They estimated distances, compared climates, and described distant lands with cautious curiosity. Some of these maps contained errors. Many were incomplete, but all of them represented a step towards seeing Earth as a whole. Evenings in the Mausian, as daylight faded, the library did not fall silent. Oil lamps were lit. The smell of burning wick filled the halls. Scholars gathered in small groups, reclining on cushions or sitting along stone benches, discussing what they had read or observed that day. These conversations were unhurried. Disagreement was not a threat, it was an invitation. Voices rose and fell gently. Someone recited a poem from memory. Another offered a correction to a mathematical proof. Laughter surfaced occasionally, brief and warm. Outside, the city settled into evening. Inside, time seemed suspended. This was the golden age, not because everything was perfect, but because curiosity was allowed to breathe. The quiet assumption of permanence, and yet beneath this harmony lay an unspoken assumption. That Alexandria would always stand, that the scrolls would always be copied, that future generations would value what had been preserved. No one feared loss, not truly. Empires felt solid. Stone felt eternal. The sea had always returned to shore. It is easy in times of abundance to believe that memory will take care of itself. The scholars of Alexandria worked as though the world had time. History, however, moves differently. A gentle closing, so in this second chapter of our journey, we leave the library alive with voices, illuminated by lamplight, rich with the confidence of discovery. The scrolls are intact. The catalog grows. The scholars walk slowly beneath the stars, certain that knowledge once gathered cannot be undone. They do not yet sense the fragility beneath their feet. They do not hear the distant footsteps of change. And thus, the wisdom of countless civilizations rested quietly on papyrus and parchment, breathing softly in the night, waiting unknowingly for time to test its endurance. If one were allowed to wander freely through the Library of Alexandria during its height, the first realization would be unexpected. It was not a single room, nor even a single building. It was a living system, a carefully designed landscape of memory, thought, and quiet discipline. The library existed as part of the Mausean, a complex of structures arranged not for spectacle but for reflection. Columns did not rise to impress. They rose to shade. Courtyards were not decorative. They were places for walking slowly while thinking. The architecture itself seemed to understand the pace of thought and adjusted accordingly. Nothing here rushed the mind. Everything invited it to linger. Spaces designed for thought, the buildings of the Mausean were arranged around open courtyards filled with trees, fountains, and stone benches worn smooth by decades of use. These spaces were not accidental. Ancient philosophers believed that walking gently aided memory and clarity. Here, ideas unfolded at the speed of footsteps. Long hallways connected reading rooms where scrolls were stored in niches along the walls. These niches, wooden or stone compartments, were carefully labeled. Small tags made of parchment or wood identified the author, title, and subject of each scroll. The air inside these rooms was cool and dry, designed to protect papyrus from moisture and decay. Windows were positioned high, allowing light to enter without exposing scrolls directly to the sun. Knowledge was treated as something both precious and vulnerable. The scribes at the heart of preservation stood the scribes. They were trained meticulously, their handwriting practiced until it became almost invisible, clear, consistent, without flourish. A good scribe was not remembered. He vanished into the text. Copying a scroll was not mechanical labor. It was an act of devotion. A scribe would sit at a low desk, the papyrus stretched carefully before him. Ink was prepared from soot and plant resin. The reed pen was sharpened repeatedly throughout the day. Mistakes were not tolerated lightly. A single miswritten word could alter meaning, corrupt an argument, or distort a medical instruction. For important works, multiple copies were compared line by line to identify errors. This process was slow, painfully slow. And yet it was the only way knowledge survived. Versions, variations, and truth, one of the quiet revolutions of Alexandria was the recognition that texts change over time. Before the library, many works existed in multiple versions, copied and recopied across generations. Errors accumulated. Passages were added or removed. Stories shifted subtly with each retelling. Alexandrian scholars noticed this. Rather than accept any single version as absolute, they compared scrolls. They asked which wording made the most sense, which passage aligned with the author's style, which errors were likely copying mistakes rather than intentional changes. This practice gave birth to textual criticism, the careful analysis of texts to reconstruct their most authentic form. Truth here was not assumed, it was pursued. A living catalog, the catalog of the library was never complete. Callimachus' Pinax grew constantly, revised as new works arrived and classifications evolved. Subjects expanded, categories subdivided. Knowledge resisted confinement, and the librarians adapted. Some scrolls defied easy categorization. Was a work on astronomy also philosophy? Was a poem also history? The librarians debated these questions quietly, aware that classification shapes how future generations understand the past. To organize knowledge is to interpret it. Alexandria understood this responsibility. Preservation against time papyrus, though remarkable, was not eternal. Humidity caused it to soften. Dryness made it brittle. Insects found it edible. Fire consumed it instantly. The librarians knew this. Scrolls were rotated, copied regularly, older versions replaced by fresh ones. Works deemed especially important were copied more frequently, ensuring their survival even if one copy failed. This system required constant attention. Preservation was not passive, it was a daily practice. The human element, yet no system is stronger than the people who sustain it. The library relied on rulers for funding, on scribes for accuracy, on scholars for relevance, on translators for clarity. Every link mattered. A change in political priorities could reduce support. A careless scribe could introduce errors. A neglected text could disappear quietly without ceremony. The library did not collapse suddenly. Its vulnerability was subtle. The illusion of stability to those who lived and worked within the Mausian, the system felt stable. The shelves were full. The lamps burned nightly. New scholars arrived each year. Time moved slowly here. Outside, however, the world was changing. Empires shifted. Religious ideas evolved. Military conflicts flared and faded. The values that once supported open inquiry began in some places to narrow. Alexandria remained confident, perhaps too confident, that knowledge would always be valued for its own sake. History rarely grants such assurances. A gentle closing, and so in this third quiet passage of our journey, we glimpse the delicate machinery that held the world's memory together. Stone and papyrus, ink and patience. Human hands working carefully against the slow erosion of time. The library stands not as a fortress, but as a balance, always requiring care, attention, and belief. For now, the balance holds. The scrolls rest securely in their niches. The scribes continue their work. The scholars walk beneath the fading light, unaware that the system they trust so deeply depends on forces far beyond its walls. Thus, the architecture of memory stood quietly in the evening air, holding centuries of thought in fragile harmony, waiting unknowingly for the currents of history to shift. The Library of Alexandria did not listen only to the familiar voices of Greece and Egypt. Its ambition reached far beyond the borders of any single kingdom or language. It listened outward, toward deserts, mountains, rivers, and seas, toward lands known only through rumor, trade, and the fragile testimonies of travelers. Each new scroll that entered the library was not merely a document. It was a voice crossing distance and time. To receive it was to invite another world inside. The long roads to Alexandria, some knowledge arrived by ship, carried across the Mediterranean in the holds of merchant vessels. Other ideas traveled far more slowly, borne by caravans that crossed arid plains and mountain passes. These routes were ancient even then. From the east came stories of Indian mathematics, astronomical observations recorded beneath unfamiliar skies, and philosophical reflections shaped by different questions about existence. From Mesopotamia arrived records of star movements kept for centuries, etched first in clay and later translated onto papyrus. From Egypt itself came religious texts older than any Greek poem, hymns and rituals passed down through temples that had already stood for thousands of years. Each scroll carried the marks of its journey, creases, faded ink, annotations added by previous readers. Alexandria did not erase these marks. It studied them. Translation as transformation translation was not simple substitution of words. Many ideas had no direct equivalent in Greek. Concepts shaped by climate, religion, and daily life resisted easy conversion. Translators debated endlessly over single phrases, sometimes inventing new vocabulary to carry unfamiliar meanings. A word for soul in one language did not map neatly onto another. A description of time might feel circular in one culture, linear in another. The translators of Alexandria approached this challenge with humility. They did not assume that Greek was superior. They treated language as a bridge, not a filter. In doing so, they preserved not only information, but world view. The wisdom of the Nile Egyptian knowledge held a special place in the library. The priests of Egypt had been observing the stars, the river, and the cycles of life since long before Greek philosophers began writing. Their calendars aligned with the flooding of the Nile. Their architecture encoded astronomical alignments. Their medicine blended observation with ritual. Greek scholars did not dismiss this knowledge as superstition. They studied it. They compared Egyptian geometry to Greek proofs. They examined medical practices that used plants unknown in Greece. They copied funerary texts not as religious artifacts alone, but as insights into how a civilization understood life and death. Alexandria became a meeting place where reverence met inquiry. Echoes from Mesopotamia, from the lands between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, came records unlike anything else. Mesopotamian astronomers had recorded planetary movements for centuries, sometimes millennia. Their clay tablets preserved precise observations of eclipses, conjunctions, and seasonal cycles. When these records reached Alexandria, scholars recognized their value immediately. They compared Babylonian data with their own observations, discovering patterns that would later influence Greek astronomy profoundly. Here, empirical knowledge transcended culture. The stars, after all, belonged to no empire. India and the East information from India arrived more rarely, filtered through many intermediaries. Yet even fragments were treasured. Mathematical ideas traveled westward. Concepts of zero, advanced arithmetic, and geometric insights that challenged existing frameworks. Philosophical reflections on consciousness, impermanence, and cycles of existence stirred quiet curiosity among Alexandrian thinkers. These ideas did not dominate the library, but they lingered. Sometimes a single sentence in a scroll could reshape a scholar's thinking for years. Geography beyond the horizon, the library also collected accounts of lands barely understood. Explorers described distant coastlines. Traders spoke of monsoon winds that reversed direction with the seasons. Sailors told of currents that carried ships far off course, stories that were recorded not as legends, but as data. Alexandrian geographers attempted to reconcile these accounts with maps. They measured distances. They debated whether certain lands were islands or extensions of continents. Some conclusions were wrong, but the method, careful listening, comparison, and restraint was revolutionary. A chorus, not a single voice. What made Alexandria extraordinary was not the dominance of one tradition, but the coexistence of many. Contradictions were allowed to remain unresolved. Multiple explanations could sit side by side. A theory did not erase another simply by existing. This plurality was not chaos. It was richness. The library did not seek a final answer. It sought understanding. The quiet cost of inclusion, yet gathering voices from everywhere, carried its own tension. Not all ideas aligned with prevailing beliefs. Some challenged political authority. Others questioned religious narratives. Knowledge once gathered could not be controlled entirely. The library trusted in openness, but openness requires protection. Without it, voices fall silent not through debate, but through neglect or suppression. The seeds of vulnerability were already present, though unseen. A gentle closing, and so, in this fourth movement of our journey, we listen as the ancient world speaks through many tongues. From river valleys and deserts, from temples and markets, from observatories and ship decks, voices converge quietly in Alexandria. They do not shout. They do not demand. They simply wait, recorded in ink, carried on fragile reeds, trusting that someone, somewhere in the future, will listen. Thus, the chorus of the ancient world rested together beneath the same roof, woven into a shared memory, patient, vulnerable, and quietly magnificent, as the night settled gently over the city. The story of the Library of Alexandria does not end with a single moment. There is no lone night when flames rose suddenly and the world's memory vanished in one terrible breath. History does not give us such clarity. Instead, it offers fragments, quiet references, passing remarks, shadows at the edges of chronicles. The end of the library is not a scream. It is a slow fading. And to understand that fading, we must move gently, without accusation or drama, listening carefully to what the ancient sources actually say and what they do not. A city in a changing world, Alexandria did not exist outside of history. It stood within it. By the 1st century BCE, the world around the library was shifting. The Hellenistic kingdoms born from Alexander's empire were weakening. Rome, methodical and relentless, was extending its influence across the Mediterranean. Egypt, once stable under the Ptolemies, became politically fragile. Court intrigue replaced philosophical debate. Loyalty mattered more than curiosity. The library still stood, but the ground beneath it was less certain. Julius Caesar and the harbor fire, one of the earliest moments associated with the library's damage, comes from an unexpected place: a military campaign. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey. Political tensions escalated quickly. Fighting broke out near the harbor. According to later Roman writers, Caesar ordered ships in the harbor burned to prevent enemy forces from using them. The fire spread beyond the docks, reaching warehouses and nearby structures. Some ancient sources suggest that scrolls stored near the harbor were destroyed in this fire. Others remain silent. Crucially, no contemporary account states clearly that the Great Library itself was destroyed at this moment. If loss occurred, it may have been partial, a wound, not an ending. A quiet reduction rather than a final erasure. The problem of distance, the main library complex was likely located within the royal quarter, away from the harbor. However, Alexandria housed more than one repository of texts. A secondary collection, sometimes called the daughter library, existed at the Serapeum, a temple complex dedicated to the god Serapis. Scrolls were distributed between institutions, perhaps as a safeguard, perhaps as expansion. This complicates the story. Which library burned? How many scrolls were stored there? Were they originals, copies, or working texts? History does not answer cleanly. Silence in the sources, what is perhaps most striking is how quietly the ancient world responds. There is no widespread mourning recorded, no sudden acknowledgement that humanity's greatest archive had been lost, no immediate sense of catastrophe. This suggests something important. The library may not have vanished suddenly enough to shock the world. It may have declined gradually, scroll by scroll, funding cut by funding cut, interest fading as priorities changed. Loss through neglect leaves fewer witnesses. Religious shifts and cultural change as centuries passed, Alexandria changed again. New religious movements rose. Older traditions were reinterpreted or replaced. The role of pagan institutions diminished, and with them, the support systems that sustained places like the Mausian. In 391 CE, the Serapeum was destroyed during religious conflict. Ancient writers describe the demolition of statues and temples. Whether scrolls remained there by this time is uncertain. Some accounts suggest the shelves were already empty. Others suggest fragments were lost. Again, certainty eludes us. The myth of a single flame, the popular image, a single inferno consuming all knowledge, is likely a simplification. The true story is quieter. Knowledge disappears most often not through fire, but through disinterest. When texts are no longer copied, they decay. When scholars are no longer supported, they leave. When ideas are no longer taught, they fade. The library's greatest enemy may not have been destruction. It may have been time. What survived despite the losses, not everything vanished. Many works associated with Alexandria survived elsewhere, copied, taught, translated again. Carried forward by scholars who left the city and took fragments of its spirit with them. The library was not a vault, it was a network, and networks once formed are difficult to erase completely. A gentle closing, and so in this fifth quiet turning of our journey, we stand not before roaring flames, but before uncertainty. The shelves thin, the voices grow fewer, the lamps burn lower each night. No one announces the end. The library simply becomes less present in the world's memory. Thus, the greatest collection of knowledge ever assembled did not vanish in a moment of terror, but drifted slowly into silence, its absence noticed only after generations had passed, like a constellation no longer recognized in the night sky. When certainty fades, questions remain. The disappearance of the Library of Alexandria has never settled into a single explanation, because history did not preserve one. Instead, it left behind scattered references, indirect observations, and long stretches of silence. Into that silence, generations have stepped carefully, offering theories not as accusations, but as attempts to understand a gradual unraveling. To explore these theories is not to chase drama. It is to acknowledge complexity. The library's end was not an event. It was a process. Theory 1, gradual decline, the most widely accepted view among modern historians, is also the quietest. The library declined slowly. Funding decreased as political priorities shifted. Royal patronage weakened. Scholars moved elsewhere. Copying slowed. Buildings aged. Collections thinned. In this view, there was no singular catastrophe, only erosion. As fewer scribes copied texts, older scrolls decayed. As fewer students arrived, fewer teachers remained. As fewer rulers valued inquiry for its own sake, institutions built on curiosity lost support. Knowledge did not burn. It stopped being renewed. This explanation lacks spectacle, but it aligns with how institutions often fade through neglect rather than violence. Theory 2, repeated damage over time. Another possibility suggests not one loss, but many. Small fires, political unrest, localized destruction, occasional looting, each incident removing a portion of the collection. Over centuries, even minor losses accumulate. A warehouse fire here, a riot there, a policy change that redirects funds. No single moment mattered enough to be remembered clearly. Together, they mattered profoundly. Theory 3, religious transformation. Some later writers point to religious conflict as a cause. As Christianity became dominant in the Roman world, pagan institutions lost official support. Temples were repurposed or dismantled. Philosophical schools associated with earlier traditions declined. The destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE is often cited in this context. Yet by this time, the library may already have been a shadow of itself. The shelves might have been nearly empty. The building may have outlived its purpose. What was destroyed may have been stone and symbol, not scrolls. Theory 4. The library that lived on elsewhere. There is also a quieter, more hopeful interpretation. The library may not have died. It may have dispersed. Scholars trained in Alexandria carried their methods with them. Texts copied there traveled outward to Rome, to Byzantium, to the Islamic world. The spirit of Alexandria lived not in walls, but in practice. In this view, the library did not vanish. It dissolved into the world. Why the mystery persists, the absence of clear evidence frustrates modern expectations. We want definitive answers, dates, causes, responsibility, but ancient historians wrote differently. They recorded what mattered to them: wars, rulers, omens, not always institutions of learning. A closed library was not headline news. Silence in ancient history does not mean insignificance, it means omission. The danger of simplification to reduce the library's fate to a single villain or event is tempting but misleading. Such stories comfort us by making loss seem exceptional. In truth, the loss of knowledge is ordinary. It happens quietly, repeatedly, everywhere. The Library of Alexandria stands out not because it was lost, but because it dared to gather so much in the first place. A gentle closing, and so, in this sixth reflection, we walk among theories rather than ruins. We listen to scholars separated by centuries, all speaking carefully, aware of what they cannot know. The mystery remains not because history failed us, but because it unfolded gradually beyond the reach of dramatic memory. Thus, the fate of the library rests in the space between facts, a space filled with patience, uncertainty, and the quiet reminder that understanding the past often means learning to live with unanswered questions, as the night settles softly once more. It is tempting to imagine the Library of Alexandria as a perfect archive, a place where all human knowledge was preserved intact, waiting patiently for the future. But even at its height, the library was selective. It gathered what it could reach, what it could copy, what it could understand. And yet, what it held was vast enough that its loss still echoes. To consider what may have disappeared is not to indulge in fantasy, but to acknowledge how fragile memory truly is. The silence of missing voices, most ancient works are known to us only by name. We know they existed because someone once mentioned them. A line in a letter, a reference in a commentary, a title listed in a catalog, then nothing. The words themselves are gone. Entire schools of thought, philosophical arguments, scientific treatises, historical accounts survive only as shadows cast by other texts. Alexandria was one of the few places where such works might have rested together. When they faded, they did not leave ruins. They left silence. Lost histories, ancient historians wrote far more than what survives today. Accounts of early civilizations, local histories of cities now erased. Detailed narratives of cultures that left little else behind. Without these texts, our picture of the past narrows. History becomes a corridor instead of a landscape. Alexandria may have held voices that told different stories, perspectives not centered on conquest or kings, but on daily life, belief, and continuity. Their absence shapes how we understand antiquity. Mathematics without descendants, some ancient mathematical works appear to have no direct descendants. Ideas hinted at in surviving texts suggest techniques that were never fully transmitted. Methods for solving problems, geometric constructions, numerical insights that could have accelerated understanding centuries earlier. When such works vanished, progress did not stop, but it slowed. Civilization did not forget how to think, it had to rediscover. Engineering and applied knowledge, the ancient world was capable of remarkable engineering. Machines powered by water, air, and counterweights existed. Complex construction techniques allowed for monuments that still stand. Yet many practical manuals are lost. How were certain devices built? What materials were used? What trial and error knowledge guided craftsmen? Alexandria likely held technical writings, not spectacular but essential. Their disappearance left later generations to begin again. Medicine and the human body. Alexandrian physicians documented anatomy and treatment in detail. They described nerves, organs, and functions with clarity rare for the time. They distinguished between symptoms and causes. Some of this knowledge survived through later traditions. Much did not. As medical texts vanished, misconceptions returned. Practices grounded in observation gave way at times to speculation. The human body did not change. Understanding of it did. Philosophies without followers. Not all philosophies attract disciples. Some offer subtle insights that do not promise certainty or power. Such ideas are easily overlooked. Alexandria was a place where even minor voices could be preserved. When those texts vanished, certain ways of thinking vanished with them, not refuted, not replaced, simply forgot. The loss is immeasurable because we cannot measure what we cannot remember. The weight of absence, what was lost, is not only information, it is continuity. When knowledge breaks, future generations must reconstruct from fragments. They may arrive at similar conclusions, but the path is longer, the effort greater. Alexandria represented a moment when humanity briefly held a conversation with itself across centuries. When that conversation faltered, something subtle but profound was lost. A gentle closing, and so, in this seventh contemplation, we stand before absence rather than artifact. We feel the shape of what is no longer there, the outlines left behind by vanished words. The library does not haunt us with what we know it held, but with what it might have held, ideas that once existed, were once understood, and then quietly slipped beyond memory. Thus, the missing voices rest in silence, not in darkness, but in the quiet space where history ends and imagination begins, as the long night breathes gently onward. When the lamps of Alexandria dimmed, the world did not fall into darkness. Life continued. Cities rose and fell. Empires expanded and withdrew. New ideas appeared as they always do. Yet beneath these movements, something subtle had changed, something almost imperceptible to those living through it. The great unifying center of knowledge was gone, and without it, learning began to move differently. A world without a center, Alexandria had been a gathering place, a point where ideas converged, compared, and refined. When that point weakened, knowledge scattered. Learning became regional again. In some places, texts survived because they were useful, in others because they aligned with religious teaching. In many places, they disappeared because there was no longer a reason or support to preserve them. This was not destruction. It was redistribution, and redistribution changes emphasis. The Roman relationship with knowledge. Rome admired Greek thought, but it approached learning differently. Roman culture valued application over inquiry. Engineering, law, administration, these were prized. Abstract philosophy and speculative science were less central. Roman scholars preserved many Greek works, but not all. Some texts were copied because they served practical needs. Others were allowed to fade. Alexandria's absence meant there was no longer an institution dedicated solely to asking, "What should we preserve, even if we do not yet know its value?" The long quiet in scientific progress after Alexandria, scientific advancement did not stop, but it slowed. Observational astronomy continued. Medicine persisted. Mathematics survived. Yet the spirit of systematic, open-ended inquiry became rarer. Without a place where scholars could devote entire lives to thinking, progress became dependent on individuals rather than institutions. When such individuals appeared, knowledge advanced. When they did not, it waited. Preservation through translation. Ironically, some of Alexandria's spirit found refuge far from Egypt. Centuries later, during the Islamic Golden Age, scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic. They preserved, expanded, and commented upon works that might otherwise have vanished entirely. Many of these texts had once passed through Alexandria, either directly or through its influence. Knowledge returned, transformed but continuous. This was not revival. It was continuation delayed. The Renaissance and rediscovery much later still. Europe rediscovered ancient texts through translation from Arabic and Greek manuscripts preserved in monasteries. Ideas that once circulated freely in Alexandria returned cautiously, framed as rediscoveries rather than inheritances. The loss of continuity made innovation feel like rebirth. The long silence between made each recovered idea seem miraculous. What might have been, it is tempting to imagine a world where the library never faded, where continuous scholarship bridged antiquity to modernity without interruption, where scientific method matured earlier, where understanding accumulated without repeated loss. But history does not move along imagined paths. It moves through what survives. Alexandria reminds us that progress depends not only on brilliance but on care. A gentle closing, and so in this eighth reflection we stand in the centuries after the library, a world still learning, still thinking, but doing so without the steady flame that once burned beside the Mediterranean. The shelves are quiet now, the voices dispersed. Yet their echoes continue, carried through translations, through rediscovery, through the persistent human desire to understand. Thus, knowledge moved onward, reshaped by absence, patient in its return as time flowed softly across generations. Even when the Library of Alexandria faded from daily life, its idea refused to die. The physical shelves may have thinned, the scrolls may have vanished. Yet the notion of gathering all human knowledge in a single place lingered like a quiet whisper, shaping minds long after the city itself no longer held sway. To follow these echoes is to trace the library's influence not in bricks or papyrus, but in imagination, aspiration, and the persistent human desire to remember and understand. Alexandria in memory writers, philosophers, and travelers referenced Alexandria for centuries. It became a symbol, a place of ultimate learning, a home for curiosity, a sanctuary where human thought was both sacred and communal. Even the very mystery of its loss added weight to its legend. In this way, the library's absence became part of its presence. To speak of Alexandria was to speak of ambition and impermanence together, a reminder that knowledge is precious precisely because it can be lost. The Islamic Golden Age during the early medieval centuries, scholars across the Middle East revived Greek texts, including works that had once passed through Alexandria. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad mirrored Alexandria's mission in many ways. Collections of manuscripts from far-flung regions, scholars from diverse lands working side by side, translation as a tool for understanding. Not merely utility, dedication to observation, measurement, and study in some sense. Alexandria's spirit traveled eastward, preserved not in a building, but in a method and a commitment. Medieval and Renaissance Europe centuries later, European scholars rediscovered classical texts through translations from Arabic, sometimes traveling through multiple languages before reaching Latin. Humanists marveled at the precision, the ambition, and the breadth of knowledge the Greeks and Egyptians had amassed. They dreamed of recreating Alexandria not as a single library, but as a network of learning, universities, academies, and collections where knowledge could flourish again. Here, too, the library's influence was felt indirectly, through the idea of preservation and the ethos of curiosity it had fostered. The symbol of ultimate knowledge by the modern era, Alexandria had become more than history. It was a mythical reference, a metaphor for human ambition, a warning about the fragility of memory, a challenge to future generations. Could we gather, preserve, and protect knowledge better? This is the library that lives today, less as a physical collection, more as a concept, guiding libraries, museums, and digital archives worldwide. Knowledge as continuity, the story of Alexandria also reminds us that knowledge is not static. Even when destroyed, it often returns, transformed, reframed, rebuilt. Texts rediscovered through translation, ideas reconstructed from fragments, observations replicated centuries. Later, the library's loss created gaps, yes. but it also sparked renewal, motivating humans to seek, protect, and share knowledge with renewed care. The echo of Alexandria is thus ongoing, a thread of memory stretching from antiquity into the present day. A gentle closing, and so, in this ninth reflection, we stand in the afterimage of the library, a space filled not with scrolls, but with possibility. Its voice whispers still, not as a roar, but as a soft invitation, to observe carefully, to question gently, and to value the fragile record of human thought. Thus, the Library of Alexandria endures as a beacon of curiosity, a reminder that knowledge is both treasure and responsibility, as the quiet passage of centuries folds softly around the idea of a city that once sought to hold the world's memory. We arrive at the final stretch of our journey, where time itself seems to slow, as if the Mediterranean sun hangs gently over the centuries, and the gentle hum of memory reverberates softly in the mind. The Library of Alexandria is gone. Its scrolls have faded. Its halls are silent. Yet, as we have walked through its story, we discover that the absence itself is not empty. It carries lessons, echoes, and the quiet pulse of human curiosity that refuses to be extinguished. Here, in this reflective space, we pause to consider what the library truly represents, not merely as a building, but as a vision. The fragility of knowledge history teaches that knowledge is never permanent. Scrolls decay, buildings crumble, voices grow quiet. The library reminds us that learning is fragile. It requires care, attention, and reverence. The scholars of Alexandria understood this instinctively. They devoted themselves to copying, translating, cataloging, observing, and preserving, knowing that every act of preservation was an act of hope. The library's disappearance shows us that even the most extraordinary human achievements are vulnerable, not only to fire or conquest, but to the slow erosion of time and neglect. The enduring spirit, yet fragility, does not imply futility. Alexandria lives on in. The scholars who carried its teachings across the Mediterranean, the texts preserved, translated, and rediscovered the ethos of patient observation and meticulous care, the imagination of countless generations who have sought to emulate it even when the physical library vanished. The principles it embodied, curiosity, reverence for learning, and commitment to understanding, persisted. Its spirit migrated, like a seed, finding fertile ground wherever human thought valued continuity. A world transformed by absence, there is a quiet paradox here. The library's absence shaped the world as much as its presence ever did. Gaps in knowledge inspired rediscovery, lost texts created challenges that sparked innovation. The myth of Alexandria motivated centuries of preservation and scholarship through absence. The library taught patience, resilience, and humility. It reminded humanity that even the greatest achievements can be fleeting, and that the care we give to memory determines how it survives. The gentle wisdom of listening. As we reflect, we realize that Alexandria also teaches the value of listening. To voices from distant lands, to ideas that may seem strange or foreign to knowledge preserved quietly, in marginal notes or fragmented manuscripts. Listening, in this sense, is not passive. It is attentive, patient, and reverent. The library's scholars were masters of this art, walking slowly through their courtyards, observing, translating, debating, and preserving. They teach us that wisdom often emerges from the quiet act of noticing. The eternal allure of mystery even today, the library retains its aura of wonder. We cannot know exactly what was lost. We may never know the full scope of ideas that vanished. And yet this uncertainty is itself beautiful. Mystery in this context is not frightening. It is inviting. It encourages imagination, reflection, and the pursuit of knowledge with care and patience. The gaps left by Alexandria remind us that the unknown is as compelling as the known, and that wonder persists where certainty ends. A gentle closing, and so, as our journey through Alexandria concludes, we sit quietly among imagined scrolls, beneath a sky that has not changed for millennia. We feel the rhythm of scholars walking in courtyard shade, the faint smell of ink and papyrus, the soft glimmer of lamplight reflecting on polished stone floors. The library may have vanished from sight, but it lives in every careful observation, every patient act of preservation, every thoughtful question asked across generations. And so, as the echoes of the ancient world soften into the night, we are reminded, knowledge is fragile yet enduring. Memory is fleeting yet persistent. Wonder is eternal. Thus, the story of the Library of Alexandria rests gently in our hearts. A journey through time, through thought, and through the quiet, timeless pursuit of understanding.